Hey, Fanboy Nation.
This is your pal Daffy Duck, and you're watching.
We're watching Fanboy.
Fanboy, etc.
Fanboy Nation.
I assume Tom.
Mike McGuff, we are talking about Runaway Radio. Congratulations on this documentary.
No, thank you so much. Long time coming.
Listen, man, here's the thing. I remember seeing an interview with Frank Zappa, and Zappa said music was better when it was run by the suits, the cigar chomping guys that were in the office that sat there and didn't really know what was going on, but they're like, what the hell, we'll give it a shot. And that's how so many of these, 60s, 70s, and early 80s artists were created. And then eventually, the generation just prior to Gen X, the me generation, at the tail end of the boomers, took over and go, no, I'm young, I'm hip, I got a slick back ponytail, I got my finger on the pulse of everything that's cool, listen to me, and then everything went extremely commercial. When we go back and visit KLOL, K101 in Houston, and what it was to what music stations have become, is that disheartening when you get to revisit those moments and go, where are we now?
Yeah, it was interesting going back, and I obviously listened to it growing up, but when you start going back and really diving into the video and the articles and the photos, you're like, wow, it really takes you back to that time. And I was realizing how different things were changing, and even during the course of production, things were changing. And I think also, I totally agree with Zappa on that. And maybe the other thing that killed it all were the accountants and spreadsheets that get involved in this world too. That is not good for creativity, I would guess.
It's got to be something that like you sit there and you're like, and now like iHeart owns, the majority of radio stations in the country. And George Soros bought 234, I believe, radio stations in the country. So there's no more autonomy or individuality unless we're going to podcasts. And in podcasts, we can't sit there and go, hey, I found this great new band, because now you're going to get dinged, whether it's YouTube or Spotify or whomever, that's going to sit there and go, no, copyright infringement. So like, how do we discover great new music the way we did in the era of KLOL?
Yeah, actually, that is a great question, because you can discover stuff on streaming, but only if the algorithm is feeding to you what is new, and it might not based on what you're listening to. And we also don't even have a lot of the music blogs as much as we used to anymore either, because that's hard with, digital advertising to maintain as well. So there are a lot of hurdles, but even back then, those radio stations had a hurdle with the FCC as far as content. So I guess there's always a roadblock. And sometimes with a roadblock, creativity will come. The good news is, just in the course of releasing the film, when I played in Minneapolis, there's a station there called The Current, which is a local station, live DJs, talking, curating cool music. We play Austin, and we had DJs in attendance from KUTX, another station like that, local, believes in the community. So maybe we are seeing a resurgence out there of this type of radio, and it's slowly bubbling up in, the cool cities, and the rest of us will eventually get it too.
You're a Texas boy. This is a Texas story. Texas is its own entity. Like, I loved Houston. I loved San Antonio. Dallas, sorry, Cowboys fans, I can take you or leave you. Austin is trying to be mini San Francisco, and I'm originally from San Francisco. I don't need you either. I'm just throwing it out there. Who cares? But like, when you sit there and you revisit this stuff, and it's like, hey, this is like, Sammy even says, if they liked you, they played you. If they thought you sucked, you weren't on the air. And it was like almost a punk rock vibe without necessarily being punk rock, in that it was rebellion. They gave you the finger, they did what they wanted, and it was pure rock and roll. Where have we lost that rebellious state in the last, I'd say, 25 to 30 years? I mean, obviously 9/11 is one big thing, but like, the return of boy bands in the late 90s through where we are now, like, there's no real rebellion anymore in music.
No, yeah, I guess really, if you think about it, that period was happening with Britney Spears and the boy bands of the late 90s. But at the same time, on MTV TRL, they'd have the new metal bands, which at least that was, maybe it was somewhat corporatized, but they did have a rebellious sound and a look at the time. But you're right. I think 9/11 really changed stuff in music. And even some of the DJs, we didn't go into this, but some of the DJs still, like Outlaw Dave at KLOL, said that 9/11, they were really clamped down upon after that. The music playlists were being filtered by corporate. And then he said further than that was the Janet Jackson Super Bowl moment, which actually did happen in Houston. He said that was also when those companies really started clamping down because they were so afraid of the FCC complaints and violations that were happening as a result of the Super Bowl that they didn't want the radio stations also to cause problems. You'll hear Howard Stern talk about that as a pivotal time for him to leave terrestrial radio and go to Sirius satellite.
And I'm not picking on bubblegum pop or any of that stuff. There's a place for it. I enjoy it from time to time. You can't just sit there and be rock and roll 24 hours a day. That doesn't work. You can't be gangster rap 24 hours a day. That just doesn't work. You got to have fun and enjoy the moment. But, like we said, the rebellion's gone. I mean, these were like wild parties. It's like, hey, we're doing an outdoor festival. And we end up, it's like grandma's backyard because she owns 140 acres that the radio station rented. And now it's just this wild kegger over there. Like, it almost seems that like country music has kind of taken over the rock and roll scene, at least Nashville wise. Is that a fair assessment to say?
Oh, I think that's totally true. And it's interesting that like I never was a huge country fan, but my wife is. She's gotten me more into the outlaw country, the 70s country. I do like that. Personally, I am not that much of a fan of the new Nashville sound. But in a way, if you think about that, Nashville sound is very pop rock, almost air metally a little bit. The production is very slick. It does seem to me that country really is taking over. And I'm a big fan of Rick Beato on YouTube. And he's this music producer who looks at trends and talks to, this great musicians about working in the studio and stuff. But he actually put out a recent video that said that on the Spotify tracks, if you look at the data, that country is really surging on Spotify right now. So that's interesting. I mean, Beyonce from Houston, she's huge here, just put out a country album. So you got to wonder, are all the signals pointing to some great country revolution coming up? Maybe, yeah.
It's just interesting to see this ebb and flow, and I think we're getting tired of that whole censorship thing. Was that part of the catalyst in doing this of like, look where we were in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s, and now look where we are now, where everything's so polished. Like in the 80s, we had the polished music, but we still had those underground scenes. And now it's virtually impossible to find the underground scenes, unless you're deep diving into it. Is this a tide that's shifting and we're going into that? Like, was that part of the catalyst to make the documentary Runaway Radio?
Oh, I definitely thought that was very interesting to look at how things have changed as far as entertainment. It definitely is more sanitized everywhere. I mean, I guess, on streaming, you can find stuff on podcasts, you can find stuff. But once again, we don't have that monoculture that we did back then where everyone kind of knew about something. And then at the time, you kind of had your more edgy material and then your less edgy material. I kind of wonder if it will come back as generations change. Like, I guess, generations have to rebel against the previous ones. And if the previous ones like this more shock, then the new generation's not going to like that. And then eventually the pendulum will swing back to more edgy material.
Like how younger millennials and older Gen Z are all into digital stuff. We'll see Gen Alpha go into analog.
Well, yeah, right. Aren't they selling, vinyl? And then I hear tapes are coming back and even VHS. Now, I think that's just a trendy thing. I don't know as far as old technology will ever really make a comeback, because as I was dealing with this film and dealing with old formats, I'm like, wow, DVD, Blu-ray streaming isn't that bad when you're working with this VHS tape that's like warped on the tape and hardly can play anymore.
Right. Like I still love vinyl, but definitely a DVD, Blu-ray, 4K guy because I love having the tangible in hand. And I always told everybody if you buy it digitally, it's a lease. It's not a purchase because if that company goes out, it's gone. And
Absolutely.
I've seen that happen to my friends. But like when you put on those old records from this era and you go to the radio station and you see their vinyl lineup that they haven't gotten completely rid of, like that smell, that nostalgia factor, holding the tangible of this 12-inch vinyl, like what does that do to put you in the mindset to make the documentary Runaway Radio?
Actually, I was going to a lot of record stores in town because, funny enough, the station used to put out, and some of the other stations used to put out LPs, like, local music, comedy things like Stevens and Pruitt, who were in the film actually when they were under a different name, Hudson and Harrigan on another station, actually put out a comedy album in the 70s. So I was going through all these record shops looking at the used bin in the various section that wasn't the music. And it was fun to definitely go back in these places that I used to go. I mean, I remember shopping for music was more like hunting for me because you were always going to the used CD places in the 90s, hunting rare CD that you heard about that you didn't know where to get. And eventually you'd find it and it felt so good. And then you get to really savor it and listen to it and look at the liner notes in the CD case. So there's definitely a part of that missing that I kind of got back from going back in these record and CD stores, because now you're so used to streaming and iTunes before that. I honestly do, obviously I don't buy as many CDs and now it's almost impossible to buy CDs at this point.
Is the humor lost on you that the radio station is called KLOL and that's the biggest tagline for laugh out loud that everybody uses while not laughing at all in sending
Yeah,
text messages? And yet,
absolutely. Yeah, because when that started showing up, I was like, that's real interesting. Of course, I associate with that. And you'll see people in social media, especially with the release of this film, talking about, oh, I guess that's where LOL originated from. Of course, the LOL actually originates from K101 and the frequency, and they made the LOL to kind of represent that. But hey, you did have some great comedians like Stevens and Pruitt and their crew on there. So if they want to identify the station with LOL, that's good.
with a documentary like this and how you mentioned that there's small pockets of local community radios or radio stations, what would you tell someone that wants to try to buy, one of those lower digit or higher digit stations that, doesn't have a huge range, like basically what's college radio now or, the jazz or classical stations, and want to get into being an independent radio station or a local community radio station?
It's definitely an uphill struggle. I mean, in Houston, we do have some low power stations like KPFT and K-True, which is the Rice University radio station, which is very low power at this point. So it's out there, but I think you'd really have to tap into the people at KLOL use to get attention these days, right? You really have to use social media smartly. And it would be a struggle, although I'm sure it would be a lot of fun. But man, you got to find the right person to put the money up for that because buying a radio station, while the valuations are down compared to the past, they are still very expensive to buy and then operate with, an expensive transmitter. That's a huge power bill to deal with alone in that.
Well, KNAC, that used to be a big metal radio station here, went online in California, at least in Southern California. Now they're international that way. Maybe an online radio station at some point.
Sure. The problem with that, though, are the regulations where, if you stream, you have to pay a certain percentage. And I know that's why, you used to have these websites that would let you create your own radio streams. And you don't see those anymore because the, record companies obviously want a cut of that. And the rules were changed that they got it. So, it's hard for just an individual to stream their own music like that anymore. The really only way to do that is a playlist. I'm not even sure you could get away with it in podcasting like you could at first in podcasting.
Yeah, until you make it, and then they're like, "We want our cut."
Right. Exactly.
What's something that you learned about yourself as a music fan and as a fan of K101 or KLOL? And what's something that like you think could be revitalized from the type of rock star, or at least local rock star, that you encountered with this?
Well, I would say overall, what I learned about myself just to get this done after 14 years is I'm stubborn. I'll give myself that. Like, that's the only way I got through this, because there were many times where it looked like it just wasn't going to work, too difficult. But thankfully, I hung in there, so it came out. I used to think that it could come back when I started, and there were still a lot of people who thought it could come back, because when I started, it was 2010. It'd been off the air 6 years. I don't know if it could anymore, though. It's just because of the challenges we're talking about. And rock music, especially if it's rock music, I don't know. The rock stations seem to be dying across the country, unfortunately. So I am not that bullish on it necessarily returning. Although, like I said, the community-based radio stations that kind of are a curated type of rock sound, might have a chance, as long as you have someone with deep pockets to fund it.
All right, so I'm going to ask you this question because this was a big deal growing up for you and visiting record stores. What is now your favorite new to you song that you discovered in digging through the archives?
Oh, wow. Well, I'll be honest. Yeah. One of the DJs from the 70s slipped me a air check that he had made probably in like 78. And I was listening through this, and I mean, yeah, some of the music we know today, and some of it, like, I'd never heard this on the radio. And really, there's an album by Stephen Stills and Manassas, I think is how you say it. And I mean, that is a great album from front to back. I found it online, and I was like, I would have never known that without hearing that air check. If I hadn't been doing this documentary, I would have never known about that, because that is not something you really hear about much anymore. I think I've since seen it on deep tracks on Sirius XM, but that is not one of those bands that sticks around.
Right. It's just interesting that you discover that. The documentary itself is absolutely fantastic. I don't know how you whittled, 25, 30 years down to 83 minutes.
Yeah, that's also why it took so long. I mean, the original cut was 4 hours. Of course, there was no way you could release that. No one, even though they say, "Oh, I'd love to watch a 4-hour documentary on this," no, they would not. And there was no way we had enough, coverage, the B-roll, the pictures, the video to do that. So a lot of it was compiling it and just continually adding interviews in until it became a story. And then I would just keep watching it, and I'd have to take a few weeks breaks and come back. And, this part bores me. And if it's boring me, then we have to cut it. And that's how we did it. And my producer, Jeffrey Brown, was really good at helping me see the stuff that we needed to get rid of.
Mike, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. I know you're quite busy with everything that's going on. Congratulations on Runaway Radio. This is a fantastic look back into the 70s and 80s and, rock and roll in Texas, and really the true spirit of the Lone Star State that I think we've kind of lost, at least in modern times. Where are we going to be able to find the documentary, and remind us of the release date?
It'll be February 27th, and it will be on all your usual VOD platforms like Amazon, Apple, Google, and Vudu, and all the rest.
Awesome. And where can we find you on social media if we want to connect?
Oh, just look up Mike McGuff. You're going to find my blog. You're going to find my X or Twitter handle and Facebook. And also the movie is rock101movie.com. That's the website. There's social media for that too. So if you want to keep up on the film, you can sign up to a newsletter. You're going to see announcements there as well.
Are you also going to be doing any public screenings, after the release on VOD? Because some people obviously want to be in the theater and watch with the crowd.
Absolutely. We are having our Houston premiere March 2nd at the Alamo Drafthouse here, and there are 2 screenings. And right now we're almost sold, so we'll see who wants us to play next.
You cut out on the date for that. Can you remind us of the date one more time?
That will be March 2nd at Alamo Drafthouse in Houston. Will be the Houston premiere, and there are 2 screenings, and they're almost sold out. So hopefully someone else will have us out for more screenings.
Fantastic. Mike McGuff, thank you so much for your time. February 27th is when it's released on all VOD platforms. The documentary is Runaway Radio. Let's find something to be rebellious about that's worth getting up in arms for, and listen to some great tunes. Thank you for everything today.
Thank you so much.